If you've seen the title, you know where I'm going, but imagine, if you will, a man with enough charm and charisma that he can inspire other people to do truly terrible things that they might not otherwise have done. And no, I'm not talking about politics here. I'm talking about arguably one of the most infamous murderers who never actually killed anyone, and that is Charles Manson, the charismatic leader of the Manson family. And as I was saying a minute ago, someone who, when I started reading about his mindset, I almost felt myself sympathizing at times with some of his beliefs, which kind of lead me to wonder about my own self a little bit.
I've often wondered myself.
But you have this man who, I mean, totally embraced the free love of the 60s, the peace, love, and happiness, and then absolutely just corrupted it in a horrific way and really brought an end to the 60s, both literally and figuratively, and just killed that whole environment. And so that is tonight's topic, Charles Manson and the Manson family.
From a child born into this world, we are taught what to believe. Closed-minded we become, fearful to be deceived. Still we desire to know what lies beyond that locked door. The art of the storyteller, conjuring tales of legend and lore. History hidden, lost knowledge, things forgotten and the unknown. These are the things that direct us and will set the tone. Welcome, friends, to another episode of Nightmares on the Lost Highway.
Honestly, when I proposed this idea, I was kind of surprised we hadn't done it yet, considering how big a story this is. And to be honest, you would think with a story about, like, Charles Manson, you would almost focus on the Tate LaBianca murders and things like that. But I found so many other aspects of the story almost as interesting that really is just a smaller part of this bigger story about a guy who life failed him from the beginning. His parents, his upbringing was terrible. The system was terrible to him. They recognized that he had the potential to be this monster, and yet, because of the way things work, they couldn't keep him. And he himself did not want to live a normal life. To quote an Ozzy song, I don't want to die an ordinary man. He didn't want to be ordinary. He thought he was destined for something more. Now, at one point in time, he thought he was going to be a musician. I think he thought he was going to be an actor. And eventually what he was known for was leading this ragtag group of hippies to commit some truly heinous crimes.
And the pentagram that he drew on his forehead and stuff.
No, swastika.
A swastika that he drew on the forehead.
It started as an X to indicate he had been canceled out, I believe it was, during his trial, and then turned into a swastika. And again, I've heard the joke before, but it was like, when you come up for parole and you got a swastika carved into your head, do you really think they're going to let you out? And really, Manson himself believed that he was better off behind bars.
Yes.
But really, I found some of the things he said were just really fascinating. And really, I mean, honestly, kind of the rantings of a madman. But some of the thoughts, it was like, there were a couple of quotes that I was like, I mean, I see where the man's coming from.
Well, and you obviously we're talking about the 60s, but he was a very fluent partaker of drugs.
Yes.
So there was a lot of times the drugs were definitely filtering or coming out of his mouth as much as anything else.
He was once described as the wrong man in the right place at the right time. So
that's a good way to put it.
That sums up Manson pretty well, I think.
Well, being the historian of the group, I wanted to kind of go back to a little bit, as we've learned about, a lot of these strange tales, serial killers, murderers, a lot of it does stem, I think, goes definitely deep back into their childhood. And I think Manson, Bill already touched upon. I wanted to share a little bit of that about the very young Manson before we get into all of the horrific bad stuff that you might think we're going to talk about, and we will eventually, but we want to get into a little bit more of the detail. That's what we like to do. Well, early life. Charles Miles Maddox was born November 12th, 1934, to a 15-year-old Ada or Ada, Kathleen Maddox,
I mean,
15-year-old mother.
To be fair, and not to disparage anybody who had kids in their teens, but I think
very
at the
early.
time especially, that was very, very early, and that's not a recipe for a great start sometimes.
No. Now, he was born in Ashland, Kentucky, and Manson's biological father appears to have been a Colonel Walker Henderson Scott Sr. Now, there's a title. He was of Catlettsburg, Kentucky, against whom Maddox filed a paternity suit that resulted in an agreed judgment in 1937, so later on. Now, Scott worked intermittently at local mills in the area and had a local reputation of a con artist. So this is the daddy.
Could have been in the blood.
Could have been in the blood. He allowed Maddox to believe that he was an Army colonel, although the name colonel was merely his given name, as it seemed to be so...
All I can think of when you talk about a colonel from Kentucky.
Colonel Sanders, KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken. But he allowed him to believe that he truly was a colonel in the Army, while there was really no proof of that. Now, when Maddox told Scott that she was pregnant, he informed her that he had been called away on Army business. Yeah.
That old chestnut.
That one. So after several months, she quickly realized that he had no intentions of returning. And so ultimately, Manson never really got to know his biological father.
Well, and to be fair, it seems like his mom didn't want him either.
No, definitely not. In August 1934, before Manson's birth, Maddox married a William Eugene Manson, a laborer at a dry cleaning business. So she's improved, left the con artist stage, and got what appears to be a working man dry cleaning business. Now, Maddox often went on drinking sprees, however, with the brother, Luther Elbert Maddox, leaving baby Charles, with babysitters. Now, Maddox and her husband divorced on April 30th, 1937, so it didn't last long, after William allegedly had gross neglect of duty by Maddox. Now, Charles retained William's last name, thus Charles Manson. On August 1st, 1939, Kathleen and Luther were arrested for assault and robbery and sentenced to 5 and 10 years imprisonment, respectively. So, here we have baby Manson. Now, he was placed in the home of aunt and uncle McMeehan in West Virginia. His mother was paroled in 1942. Manson later characterized the first weeks after she returned from prison as the happiest times in his entire life. Weeks after her release, Manson's family moved to Charleston, West Virginia, where he continually played truant, and his mother spent her evenings drinking. She was arrested for grand larceny, but not convicted. The family later, once again, this time moved to Indianapolis, where Maddox met an alcoholic, Lewis Woodson Cavender Jr., through Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, and ended up marrying him in August of 1943. First offenses. In an interview with Diane Sawyer, Manson stated that when he was only 9 years old, he set his school on fire.
Wow.
He also repeatedly got in trouble for truancy and petty theft. Although there was a lack of foster home placements, in 1947, at the age of 13, Manson was placed in the Gabalt School for Boys in Terre Haute, Indiana, which really is not that far from us.
I've been there a time or two.
Drove through there many a times. A school for male delinquents run by Catholic priests. Now, Gabalt was a very strict school where punishment for even the smallest infraction, including beatings with either a wooden paddle or a leather strap. Now, Manson ran away from the Gabalt school and slept in the woods, under bridges, wherever he could to find shelter. Manson fled home to his mother and spent Christmas in 1947 at his aunt and uncle's house in West Virginia. However, his mother returned him back to Gabalt. 10 months later, he ran away again to Indianapolis. And it was there in 1948 that Manson committed his first documented crime by robbing a grocery store. At first, to simply find something to eat. However, Manson found a cigar box containing just over $100, which he used to rent a room in Indianapolis on Skid Row and to buy food. For a time, Manson had job delivery messages with even Western Union. Why don't they use that in some of their advertisements? That would be awesome. Or he attempted to live honestly. However, he quickly began to supplement his wages once again through theft. He was eventually caught in 1949. A sympathetic judge sent him to Boys Town, a juvenile facility in Omaha, Nebraska. This poor kid's getting bounced all over the place.
Yeah, he spent a lot of his early years up into his teens just bouncing around between family and institutions. And
sad, very sad. Well, after 4 days at Boys Town, he and a fellow student, Blackie Nelson, obtained a gun and stole a car. They used it to commit 2 armed robberies on their way to the home of Nelson's uncle in Peoria, Illinois. Now, Nelson's uncle was a professional thief, and when the boys arrived, he allegedly took them in as apprentices. Manson was arrested 2 weeks later during a nighttime raid on a Peoria store. And in the investigation that followed, he was linked to 2 other earlier armed robberies, and he was sent again to the Indiana Boys School, a strict reform school outside of Plainsfield, Indiana. His life kind of continues that way, but I kind of wanted to set the foundation, paint the picture, if you will, for the young Charles Manson.
Yeah, as a teen in 1951, Manson began at that point spending his time in real prison, being put away. And before he discovered the benefits of being, quote unquote, a model prisoner, he was considered dangerous. He would go on to spend half of the first 32 years of his life behind bars. And during this time, he would be described by psychiatrists and prison personnel as, and I have a list here, a very emotionally upset youth, slick but extremely sensitive, dangerous with homosexual and assaultive tendencies, having an unstable personality but potentially being able to straighten himself out, being unable to control himself, having work habits that range from good to poor, being erratic and moody, as an energetic person who hides his loneliness, resentment, and hostility behind a facade of superficial ingratiation. He was so thoroughly accustomed to being locked up that by the time he was released from a California prison in 1967, he asked the warden if he could stay. Quote, "Oh no, I can't go outside there. I knew that I couldn't adjust to that world, not after all my life had been spent locked up and where my mind was free." I mean, really, solitary confinement to him was nothing.
He knew that's where he needed to be.
He reflected on solitary confinement. He said, "You think that's confinement? In here, my mind is free. I can go anywhere I want." So
let's step back to like the 1950s during that time spree when he was bouncing around. He was actually caught raping another boy in prison by knife point. His aunt had come forward, I guess, kind of feeling a little bit of compassion, and even suggested, let's get him out of this environment. He can come live with us. And that's about the same time that happened. And, the warrants and stuff, they were just like, I don't think he's safe to be with you. I mean, obviously she's an more elderly person. And so there was the reach out of some of the family members. But as Bill was saying, he knew he needed to be behind bars. He was not safe to be out in the public.
Well, after he got released in 1967, Manson moved on to Berkeley and then San Francisco. And these were cities that were full of young people looking to embark on a new way of life. And he was sort of an older, edgier figure amongst these youths. And he amassed a small group of followers that in time would become known as the Manson family. And he started with a group of almost entirely young women in their late teens and early 20s. And of course, in the public imagination, they would become known as the Manson girls. And in time, some of these girls would come to believe without question Manson's claims that he was Jesus himself.
Yeah.
I mean, this man had
his charisma was so high. Yeah. He just had people eating out of his hand and believing whatever he was spouting off.
Now, in time, the Manson family would grow to around 100 followers in total. And they all shared his passion for an unconventional lifestyle and the habitual use of hallucinogens, such as LSD and magic mushrooms. Notable Manson family members included Charles himself, obviously, Susan Atkins, who was known as Sexy Sadie on the Spawn Ranch, which is a place that they settled. We'll talk about later. Bobby Beausoleil, Mary Bruner. She met Manson in 1967 and is regarded as his first follower. On April 15th, 1968, she gave birth to Manson's son, whom she named Valentine. There was Lynette Squeaky Fromm, who attempted to assassinate Gerald Ford in 1975. Steve Grogan, Linda Kasabian, who joined Manson after 2 failed marriages and the birth of her daughter, and then came to the Spawn Ranch commune in July of 1969. Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Van Houten, who was a former homecoming princess. And then, eventually Charles Tex Watson. Now, with his family that he's slowly building, and not all these people that I mentioned were part of the family even then, Charles eventually would head on to L.A. to pursue a music career, having learned how to play guitar in prison. He thought he was pretty good.
Yeah.
In late 1967, the group lived for a while in Topanga Canyon while trying to make connections to the music world. Of course, Manson exploited the lax social codes of the 1960s, in which runaway hippies mingling with Hollywood royalty was apparently fairly normal. And of course, with his ability to tell others what they wanted to hear and manipulate them, he managed to weasel his way into a friendship with Dennis Wilson, drummer of the Beach Boys.
And it was funny, just like what you said. From what I understood, they just kind of like run into each other, and again, his charismatic nature just won him over. So I mean, the Beach Boys, they were established, group. This would be like music royalty, and this random guy just comes up, starts talking to him, and he invites him back to the house.
It all
lets him stay there.
Yeah, it all started when Dennis picked up a couple of hitchhikers who happened to be a couple of girls from Manson's group, and then they just kind of brought Charles with them one day, and they made friends, and everybody was hanging out. But these girls, they told Wilson about this musical, mystical guru that they called Charlie, and I mean, he wanted to meet the guy.
Yeah, absolutely.
So they brought them all together. Now, the family would live at Wilson's home with him for a while. And through Wilson, Manson met other music industry players and grew increasingly fixated on his goals of stardom, all the while exerting, of course, greater and greater control over the members of the family. Living in Wilson's home, though, came to an abrupt end when, I guess, during a recording session, Manson pulled a knife on a producer. Of course, being one of the Beach Boys, that's probably not good for your image. So Wilson decided at that point he'd had enough, and he asked the Manson family to leave. Now, Manson and the family, they bounced around L.A. for a while, eventually settling at the Spawn Ranch. S-P-A-H-N, not Spawn as in like the superhero. It was an old film and television set. It was in the western San Fernando Valley, and it was owned by George Spawn, who was nearly 80 years old at the time and blind. Now, Spawn allowed Manson and the family to stay at the ranch in exchange for manual labor from the men and some of the women, and sexual satisfaction by some of the girls under Manson's direct orders.
Yeah.
Now, it was during their time at the Spawn Ranch that Charles Tex Watson joined the group and quickly became Manson's right-hand man. If Manson wanted something done, he turned to Tex to get it done. At the Spawn Ranch, Manson exercised total control over the group. Members were reportedly forbidden from wearing eyeglasses or carrying money. And one follower, Diane Lake, who was 14 when she met Manson, detailed long nights of lectures during which Manson had them take LSD, and then they would just listen to him preach at length about the past, the present, the future of humanity. And of course, during their time on the Spawn Ranch, they had more room to grow, and so the family did grow too. And eventually, they established two other ranches in the Death Valley area with his, where his followers went. So they were spread out all over California there, kind of, sort of. Now, Manson, of course, had numerous connections. Like we said, this was a time in history where it wasn't uncommon for regular people to apparently brush shoulders with famous folks, and had a lot of connections to wealthy and influential people in L.A., especially because of the time he'd spent with Dennis Wilson. He became acquainted with record producer Terry Melcher, who was the son of actress Doris Day and the boyfriend of model and actress Candice Bergen. At one point, Angela Lansbury's daughter was a hanger-on of the family and was around. And though she was never considered a member of the Manson family, she would use her mother's credit cards to buy the family food and clothing. It got so bad that Angela Lansbury would move her entire family to Ireland to get her kids away from him.
To me, it's mind-boggling that the Manson family and Charles Manson, I don't know how to politely say this, but by looking at the pictures, I mean, they did look like typical 60 hippies and all this. Yeah. They went around stoned and drugged all the time. There was like, we're going to do it at night. No. But I mean, so these people would have to recognize, come on.
They had this uninhibited lifestyle of just do what you want when you want.
Dangerous, consequences be damned. The edge, and it's like, oh yeah, come on in my house. Oh, yeah. I'm going to leave for 2 weeks. Would you mind a house set for me?
Yeah.
That's just unbelievable.
It was crazy. I guess it was sometime during their time floating around Hollywood. actor Al Lewis, none other than Grandpa Munster
from the
himself from the
Munsters.
original Munsters.
And I'm wearing my
Yeah,
Munster
I
shirt
see that.
today.
He had Manson babysit his children
What the
on
heck?
multiple occasions and described him as, quote, a nice guy when I knew him.
Well, there's an urban legend that's going around, too, that he actually, I think it was in 1965, he interviewed to be one of the Monkees out of the Monkees TV series and the band, but that's kind of iffy because he would have been in prison during that time frame.
So, no, it's crazy how he rubs shoulders with all these famous folks. But back to Melcher and Candice Bergen, they lived at the house that Sharon Tate would eventually move into with her husband Roman Polanski, who's a famous Hollywood director, directed Chinatown and Rosemary's Baby. But that's he hung out with these people in their Hollywood homes, these big fancy houses. Now Manson courted Melcher as a patron, kind of like to get his foot in the door and like, hey, you can help take care of me, I'll take care of you, kind of thing. And he even hosted the producer at the Spahn Ranch, where Melcher politely listened to Manson and the family perform. Now, Manson pinned a great deal of hope on his connections with Wilson and Melcher and all of them, and it's widely believed that once it became clear that the two men weren't going to advance his music career, Manson began to turn, and it was realizing he was never going to be Hollywood royalty, and maybe he would just turn to violence. If he was going to make a name for himself one way or the other, I guess.
Yeah.
And now it's kind of around this time that things started to come together in a certain way. And prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi, in his attempt to put together a motive for the violence that was to come, landed on Manson's obsession with what he called, Manson, Helter Skelter. Of course, this comes from the Beatles song of the same name. But Helter Skelter wasn't just a Beatles song to Manson. Helter Skelter to Manson was the pending race war that was going to happen.
It spoke to him.
In this war, thousands were going to die. The family itself was going to disappear to underground caves underneath Death Valley, and there they would wait out until it was time for them to come back up and rule what was left of the world. That was what Manson sold them on. That Helter Skelter was going to be this race war, and humanity was going to wipe itself out, and then the Manson family was going to crawl out from the shadows and rule the world. Now, Manson foretold that the first crimes would be committed by African Americans against whites. Manson was apparently very racist.
Very.
So, now the state of affairs, the state of Manson's affairs in the summer of 1969, with his musical aspirations coming to nothing and his Hollywood connections drying up, it really led him to shift his focus and tell the family, like, if Helter Skelter's not going to happen on its own, we're going to make it happen.
We're going to dial it up.
And how were they going to do this? Well, they were going to commit savage crimes in upscale neighborhoods, and they were going to draw the attention of the powers that be.
They were going to make the vision real. Yeah.
And in the process, they were going to try to pin it on black people. They were trying to make it look like it was race war type stuff. And really, they were, and another part of it was they were going to show the African Americans how it was supposed to be done, was also kind of the way they looked at it. So, in July of 1969, accompanied by other family members, Manson follower Bobby Beausoleil probably, kills acquaintance Gary Hinman. This is the first death that can be directly attributed to the Manson family. But he kills Gary Hinman in his home after holding him hostage for days by stabbing him twice in the chest with a sword brought over by Manson.
Not a knife, a sword.
I had never imagined any Manson family murder involving a sword, but there you go. Then he wrote "Political Piggy" on the wall with Hinman's blood in an effort to implicate the Black Panthers. Now, although it looks like this might be part of the Helter Skelter plan, it does appear as if the motive was simply, I guess, Hinman had come into some money and they needed it. They wanted it.
We're going to take it.
They were looking to get away from the ranch because, in part, they feared retaliation for a July 1st attack when Manson shot Bernard Lots of Papa Crow.
Lots of Papa Crow.
He believed that Crow was a part of the Black Panthers. And obviously that's very counter to what Manson was hoping to achieve. 2 days after Hinman's body was found, Manson told his family, now is the time for Helter Skelter. And so on the night of August 8th, which is the infamous night,
yes,
1969, Manson told family member Tex Watson, remember that's his right-hand man.
Right-hand man. I can trust you. Make this happen.
Enter the home of Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski and, quote, destroy everyone in it as gruesome as you can.
That's pretty vivid.
Yeah. So Tex, Patricia, Susan, and Linda all drove to the house just after midnight. Polanski was out of town working on a film, and Sharon was at home. She was 8 months pregnant at the time. She was just starting her film career. She'd appeared in the 1967 movie Valley of the Dolls and was considered one of Hollywood's most promising up-and-comers of the time. Now, she was at home. She was relaxing with some friends. She had some people over, celebrity hairstylist Jay Sebring, coffee heiress Abigail Folger, and Folger's boyfriend, Wojtek Frykowski. Now, they were all there. I guess they had retired for the evening. They were all asleep. And none of them had any connection to the Manson family in any way, other than physically being in a house previously occupied by someone Manson knew. I think he picked a Hollywood house. The belief is, a lot of people believe this house represented everything Manson was working for falling apart. This is where he'd met those people, and this is those people who had turned their back on him. And so they feel like for Manson, this was a good place to start. There was a witness at Manson's trial that described there was a day in March of 1969 when Manson came to the house looking for Melcher and found Tate on the porch instead. And so they think maybe he didn't go because they might have recognized him. Back to the night in question. Family members climbed over a brushy platform to gain entrance to the property. And if you've seen pictures of it, it kind of sits on a hillside, and it's kind of, right. It would be a climb to get to it. Now, the first person to die that night was Stephen Parent, a teenage friend of the house's caretaker, who just happened to be getting out of his car when the Manson family arrived.
Poor timing.
Yeah. He was approached by the intruders entering the property, and Tex shot him several times. They then entered the home when Watson cut a screen from the window, climbed in, and then opened the front door for the others while Kasabian kept watch. Now, Frykowski was awoken to the voice of Watson. Frykowski, who was still groggy from sleep, asked him what time it was, and Watson kicked him in the head. That's a heck of a response. Frykowski said, kind of asked him, "Who are you?" And Watson leaned in and responded, "I am the devil, and I am here to do the devil's business." The family then gathered the group at knife and gunpoint and took them to the living room where they brutally murdered Tate, Folger, Frykowski, and Sebring. They tied Tate and Sebring together by their necks. Sebring was shot and stabbed 7 times, and then Watson kicked him several times in the face as he lay dying, breaking his nose and eye socket. Frykowski was bound with a towel but managed to escape. He and Atkins began to struggle, and Atkins stabbed him in the leg several times. Then he tried to run, but Watson beat him over the head with his gun so violently that he broke the grip off the gun.
Good night.
Folger was chased down by Krenwinkel and stabbed a total of 28 times.
A bit overkill.
Yeah. Amazingly, Frykowski, who had been beat over the head, was still conscious and trying to escape by crawling across the lawn, screaming for help as Tex shot him. Then Watson came over and ultimately killed Frykowski by repeatedly stabbing him, resulting in a total of 51 stab wounds. Now, Tate was still tied up. She'd witnessed everything, and she was begging for mercy, begging for the life of her unborn child, and subsequently was stabbed 16 times, which killed her and the child.
Then I believe they used Tate's blood and wrote pig on the front door, again, trying to tie this all back to the Black Panthers and get this race war going.
Yeah, the only person on the property that night to survive was the caretaker, William Garretson, who I guess lived in a separate cottage from the main home. He managed to escape detection. Apparently, he heard nothing from his cottage. I would say probably asleep, honestly.
But I'm like, all this screaming and stuff going on, nobody heard. I mean, he shot people. There was stabbings. Yeah. There was a guy in the yard crawling across trying to get away. Tate screaming, begging for her life. There's a lot of stories that say people heard stuff, but they didn't know what they were hearing. Apparently, it wasn't uncommon to have wild, raucous parties in the area. Well, I guess I could see that, especially during the time frame.
Well, the next night, the same group of family members, plus now Leslie Van Houten and Manson himself, set out to commit more murders. They drove to the house of grocery business executive Lino LaBianca and his wife Rosemary in the Los Feliz area of Los Angeles. Now, LaBianca was totally unknown to the Manson family. I mean, basically selected at random. The only connection anybody could ever find was that some of the family members had been to a party in the same neighborhood once, maybe. After several hours of driving around these upscale neighborhoods, they just settled on the LaBianca home. And this time Manson was there. He wasn't the last time. Feeling, of course, that there wasn't enough panic among the victims of the Tate murder, which I find very hard to believe when you hear the description of what they did. So they broke into the home, and the family tied up the couple with a lamp cord and then put pillowcases over their heads. Manson assured them that they would not be hurt. They were simply being robbed. And then after stealing everything they could, Manson ordered Van Houten and Krenwinkel to kill the couple after he left. Lino was stabbed 26 times and had the word war carved into his stomach, again, trying to go back to that terror, that race war stuff. Rosemary was stabbed 41 times. This time they wrote the word rise and death to pigs, as well as a misspelling of the Beatles song Helter Skelter, which they spelled Helter, Healter. But again, they wrote that in blood on the walls.
Now I'm trying to put myself in the mind of Manson, which that's a contradictory of words. You never
don't
really
do
want
that while I'm sitting
that.
across the table from you.
But I thought it was interesting. He chooses to step out before the murder's done.
Yeah.
Hey, make this happen. I'm leaving.
Well, to go back to what I said in the intro, I mean, he's one of the most infamous murderers who really never killed anyone.
Do you think it's because he couldn't stomach it? Or do you think it was more of, I'm above you, you are my followers, you do my work. I don't need to be here.
That's kind of my thought. I don't think he was above it. I don't think he was either. Yeah, I think, or if anything, I think maybe he was just trying to keep himself removed from it, so when the time came, I didn't kill anybody.
Yeah. Well, just like in the first one, he wasn't even there. Yeah. He just sent his little troop and...
Well, Manson ordered Kasabian and Atkins to go commit another murder across town that same night.
Because 2 is not enough.
Yeah. But Kasabian deliberately failed in the attempt so that neither one of them had to murder anyone else that night. Now, the family was also responsible for the death of stuntman Donald Shea later in August. Shea was a ranch hand at the Spawn Ranch and got along with the Manson family when they first arrived. However, Charles began to look down on Shea because Shea married a black woman named Magdalene. Since Manson hated and distrusted black people in general, Magdalene, of course, was a no-no in his book, and he lost any respect he may have had for Shea. Now, she only stayed for a few weeks before leaving Shea, and Manson decided to have Shea killed. Not only for that, but he also believed that Shea had reported the family to the police, which resulted in a raid on the ranch on August 16th, during which some of the family were taken into custody on suspicion of car theft. So on August 26th, more than 2 weeks after the Tate and LaBianca murders, Susan Atkins lured Shea to a remote spot on the ranch, and there Bruce Davis, Steve Grogan, and Charles Watson asked him for a ride to a nearby car parts yard. While in the car, Grogan hit Shea over the head with a pipe wrench, and then Watson stabbed him. They then took him down a hill behind the ranch and there stabbed and tortured him to death. The brutal nature of the murders committed by the Manson family, in addition to the fact that some of the victims were celebrities, sort of touched on some deep, deep fears in America at the time. The idea that you might not be safe even in your home, which really was sort of a new concept, and the idea that even good girls were just one push away from committing unspeakable crimes. Well, later that year, Manson relocated to Death Valley, where he and some of his family members would finally be arrested in October. But it wasn't for murder. They were arrested for auto theft, the burning of equipment, and I believe they were connected to, the authorities believed that they were associated with some vandalism in Death Valley State Park. And
pretty lesser crimes of what he had actually been involved with.
Well, when they were raided, Manson managed to cram himself into a 12 by 16-inch cupboard under a sink to avoid being caught. I imagine that involves a great deal of flexibility. Now, one of those arrested implicated Atkins in an earlier murder, and while in jail, Atkins bragged to his cellmates about being involved in the Tate murders. She said, quote, "Because we wanted to do a crime that would shock the world, and the world would have to stand up and take notice." And by the end of the year, all of the killers involved were behind bars. Now, after all the family members that were behind the Tate and LaBianca murders in 1969 were apprehended, Manson was put on trial for murder along with them, although, again, we've said before, he himself didn't actually do any killing. The prosecutor argued that the family did everything Manson ordered them to do, including murder, and that was why he was included. And unfortunately for the family member Kasabian would become the star witness for the prosecution, and she was granted immunity in return for her testimony. So, in January 1971, all the defendants were found guilty, with Manson, Krenwinkel, and Atkins being sentenced to death, and Van Houten being sentenced to death in connection with the LaBianca murders. However, all the death sentences were converted to life in prison after California did away with the death penalty in 1972. Manson and his followers would ultimately claim to have killed a total of 35 people and buried their bodies in the desert. And there's a whole list, but none of these were actually ever attributed to the family. There's a list of suspected murders they were involved in, but I didn't go through that. Now, Atkins died in prison in September 2009 at the age of 61. One of California's longest standing prison inmates, Manson himself, died in November of 2017 at the age of 83 after spending 50 years in prison of cancer. I mean, he was taken to the prison hospital, and I think he spent a couple days there and passed away.
I got to say, I mean, for somebody to have been involved directly, indirectly for murders, but for a host of crimes, armed robbery, stealing cars, everything imaginable, think about the money the state spent preserving his life.
Yeah.
I know that sounds bad, but I mean, let's face it, this guy's not a good guy. And he lived to be 80-something years old.
Yep.
And 83. Wow.
Spent 50 years in prison.
More of your life behind cell bars than...
Was it the first 32? He spent 16 in prison. And then when he got arrested from 32 to 83, he spent another 50 years in prison. Out of 83 years, he spent a total of 66?
A career criminal. Career criminal.
Yeah. He was denied parole a total of 12 times. During his 2012 parole hearing, he told the board, "I have put 5 men in the grave. I'm a very dangerous man." Now, I talked about some of his quotes. I did find some of his quotes kind of interesting, some of the things he said, and some of it's the ravings of a lunatic, some of it's nonsense. But every now and then there was a little bit that kind of jumped out. One of them, "I am not a bad person. I am not a good person." He didn't see himself in those terms. Another one, "Look down at me and you see a fool. Look up at me and you see a god. Look straight at me and you see yourself."
Wow.
Sort of implying, anybody could be what
That's
he
pretty
was.
in depth, yeah.
And this one, again, when I read this one, it's for a hot minute, I almost think, man, maybe Charlie had it figured out.
As you said, we don't want to put ourselves in the mind of a murderer Manson.
But "I don't want to take my time going to work. I got a motorcycle and a sleeping bag and 10 or 15 girls. What the hell I want to go off and go to work for? Work for what? Money? I got all the money in the world. I'm the king, man. I run the underworld, guy. I decide who does what and where they do it at. What am I going to run around like some teeny bopper somewhere for somebody else's money? I make the money, man. I roll the nickels. The game is mine. I deal the cards." I mean, if you had that going for you, you want to dance
Good
to somebody else's tune.
impersonation, by the way. But
I'd watched enough Manson videos.
I could literally hear him saying that. And
he did. He had that weird kind of cadence, man. He was no nonsense.
Yeah. "I'll cut it to you straight off, and if not, I'll just cut you."
To show you a little bit about my psyche, and I didn't realize this at the time until I actually started doing this. I was familiar with the broad overview of Manson, but some of it, one of my favorite movies is The Devil's Rejects.
Oh, yeah.
It's a hard movie to watch, even for someone like me. I've seen it multiple times. Was inspired by, the likes of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, those really gory 70s horror films. But I didn't realize just how much was inspired by Charles Manson, most notably, of course, the character Otis Driftwood, played by Bill Moseley. And if they gave Oscars for acting to people who did these kinds of movies, I've seen Bill Moseley in multiple movies. He is unrecognizable, really, in this film. He is so good as this character. I mean, really, he should have won something for it. But there's a scene where he tells a person, he looks him right in the eye and he leans in close and says, "I am the devil and I'm here to do the devil's work." I mean, that's straight out of Manson.
Straight out of the story.
And again, such a good movie. But yeah, I mean, these were some really
disturbed individuals.
Yeah. And for the members of the family, misguided to say the least.
Yeah. I think a lot of them, it seems like there's always a generation of people that are just lost. They look to anything to try to find their way, whether it be religion, whether it be unfortunately a cult. Some immerse themselves into work, whatever their jobs are, but they're just trying to find themselves. And so many of these, as you were naming them off and their ages, I mean, very early age. You're talking late teens,
early 20s.
Early 20s.
He was the oldest at 30.
I mean, let's face it, young adult might not have even applied technically at this point in time.
And at that point,
you're still maturing.
I was going to say, at that point, you're still trying to figure out who you are, what you want to be. And a guy like Manson, who's got this alternate lifestyle, this free lifestyle where you're not answering to the man.
Yeah.
I mean, I could see the appeal of that. I really could.
Yeah.
And again, as people, we want to fit in somewhere. And Manson was like, come do what you want. I mean, he's talking about live it up, man.
And no
free
judgment.
Love and drugs and do whatever you want.
No judgment. We don't care from what walk of life you come from, As long as you're a white person.
As long as you're white.
Yeah,
and you do what he says.
And you do what you told. Do what you're told.
So, yeah, I get that quote about why would I want to work? Man.
Yeah.
And then there was another quote by him. It was something about regret. I kept trying to find it, but it was like, do I regret what I did? Why do I regret what I did? Do you regret what you've done to me? You locked poor Charlie up for all of his life. You know, if I smack you in the face, what seems only fair for what you've done to me? I mean, along those lines. That wasn't the exact quote, but it was something along those lines.
Yeah.
I mean.
And again, he's referencing himself in third person.
Yeah.
So
he was.
It's checking the boxes.
He was crazy.
It's
That's
checking
for sure.
the boxes. So is it time for some headlines? Well, following in suit, there is a new movie that was released, I believe it was April of this year, 2024. Manson, Summer of Blood. Now it says, in this final terrifying chapter of the world's most infamous crime of the 20th century, a dying Charles Manson is offered a chance to repent for his crimes, revealing horrific, never-before-seen details about the Sharon Tate murders, as well as a shocking twist. I was going to watch this just for this episode, but I ran out of time. I did see where it had a IMDb rating for, I think, about a 7 out of a 10. I read some of the reviews. They were not kind. A lot of them weren't.
The 7's not.
A 7's not horrible.
Out of 10,
I've watched a lot of movies that were 6s that I even enjoyed.
I was going to say, I've seen movies a lot lower that I liked.
But it stars Wes Gillum, who plays an older version of Charlie Manson, and David Burkhart, who plays an earlier version of Charles Manson. The movie fared, as I said, kind of average ratings. Some critics argued that the cast, and this is cruel, but had no acting skills other than stating that the story had been told over and over again. So in all fairness, they felt it was hard to get a new take on it. And I was intrigued when it said, revealing horrific, never before seen information. I'm thinking, okay, well, this story has been done so many times. What would there possibly be that hasn't been revealed?
Again, Charlie wasn't there.
No.
So what does he know that nobody else knows?
So yeah, I may still watch this. But if you're wanting to learn more about the cult killer, it's a good place to start since it was just released, as I said, this year. Or perhaps just to review and catch up on with that special someone on a cool fall night with some popcorn and, dare I say, there will be blood. Oh, yes, there will be blood.
My headline's from JoeBlow.com.
Joe Blow.
It's a good movie website, actually. By Matthew Plale, dated April 19th, 2024. Charles Manson hypnotized Danny Trejo in prison.
Now, I knew he had spent some time with Danny Trejo in prison.
If you don't know who Danny Trejo is,
shame on you.
You've seen him. If you play video games, he's been in video games. He was in one of the Far Cry video games for sure. If you watch TV, Sons of Anarchy, I think he was in. I know he was in Breaking Bad.
He usually wears a black vest with no shirt.
So you can see the tattoo of the Senorita on his chest.
Yes.
That is his whole chest.
Yes.
If you've seen movies, From Dusk Till Dawn, Machete.
Kind of long, stringy hair.
He's just an older Mexican fellow with a real gravelly voice. Very distinctive.
Guarantee honestly, you've seen him multiple times.
If you read books, as much as Danny Trejo pops up, he's probably been in a book somewhere, I'm sure. I know he's got an autobiography out there. I've got it on my book list. I mean to read it because he's such an interesting person. I love Danny Trejo. I think he's great. He's a good, funny guy. He's got a taco truck, I think, that he runs in California. Trejo's Tacos.
He definitely has turned his life around.
Yeah, and I mean, he could have very easily have gone that route. I believe he ended up in prison for attempting to sell sugar to a federal agent. He was they came to him as a sting operation, trying to buy drugs. He didn't know where to get drugs, and so I believe at the time he was still involved in the criminal element, but he wasn't a dealer.
Okay.
And I think he tried to sell the cops a bag of sugar. And
so how do you get arrested for that?
Because because he was selling drugs. As far as they were concerned, he was selling drugs.
Oh,
and then
my gosh.
I believe while he was in prison, he turned his life around. He got involved in some kind of 12-step program. And he was actually on set of a movie where he was an actor's sponsor. And they saw him and they said, man, you look like you could be you look like somebody who could be a prisoner. And he's like, hey, straight story, I was. And they put him in the movie, and, the rest they say is history.
It's history.
So anyway, if you're a fan of Danny, you probably know he spent time in prison with a criminal record that goes back to his youth and into the 60s before he got into acting, like I said. Now, during one of his latter stints, Trejo came across a fellow who had yet to get his music career off the ground, none other than the infamous Charles Manson. Now, fortunately, Trejo took a different path than Manson did after this meeting. But that does not mean he didn't have a unique experience with the cult leader. Now, Danny recalled meeting Manson in the early 60s and even offering him protection in prison. And in turn, Manson introduced Trejo to the ways of hypnosis. And this is, from Danny, his own words. There were 3 people in my cell, and when we found out Charlie could hypnotize us, we said, well, get us loaded on weed. And he did. We were loaded on marijuana. And then after we woke up, I said, Charlie, get us loaded on heroin. And he said, all right. So 2 of us got loaded. Then the other guy, the one that didn't get loaded, Charlie asked him, have you ever been loaded on heroin? And he goes, no. So Charlie said, your mind doesn't know how to react. Now, once he figured out Manson was involved with the Tate LaBianca murders, Trejo did remember then seeing him on TV. And Manson has quite a list of celebrities that he's been linked to, like we talked about earlier. Although, of course, Danny Trejo's story is sort of unique in that it was before Danny became famous. Dennis Wilson, like we talked about from the Beach Boys, Cass Elliot of the Mamas and the Papas, Angela Lansbury, like we talked about, Candace Bergen. They were all associated in some way with the Manson family at one point or another. Danny Trejo recalled even having run-ins with women from Manson's cult, although they too were far from being on the up and up. In Danny's words again, instead of all living on the street, they lived out here on Spawn Ranch. I knew a couple of girls that stayed at that ranch, and they said the big thing they would do was pick crabs off themselves.
Ew.
They were all just little freaks.
Oh.
Yeah, kind of gross.
Well, you did bring up something there that good old Charlie obviously had some expertise with hypnotics and heroin mixing with that. That does kind of up the ante on the charismatic leader a little bit. Come on,
well,
in,
we knew there was drug use, and he had they said he had a charisma about him, a way of influencing the people around him.
I'll hypnotize you to do what I want you to do.
Maybe that's what he was doing.
Interesting. All right. Time for questions. Well, I got a question for you, Bill. When we started diving into some of these serial killers and we started featuring them on our episodes, it was all last year. I don't think we've done one
It's been a while since we did a serial killer.
But we've always tried to, present the facts the best we could and often share the other side of the story to a point that you brought up again tonight where we almost kind of feel a little sympathetic sometimes for some of them.
I know we're not bringing anything new. I don't think we're discovering anything, but I do like to take the story that everybody knows and try to go back and explain the person's history a little bit.
Shake it up, turn it upside down.
Hopefully we present something that somebody listening hadn't heard before.
Yeah. Well, often we've come to the agreement that, and I don't think it's new knowledge, but a lot of these people come from very unfavorable family conditions.
Yeah. Yeah, they got bad backgrounds.
But all that being said, I'm going to up the ante with 3 very short questions. I don't expect you to get real detailed, but 3 short questions concerning Mr. Charles Manson himself and his progression up through life. So if you were on the jury and you heard the story of Charles Manson and the facts we presented here tonight, would you, as a member of the jury, number 1, would you accept that Manson was guilty with his involvement with the Tate murders?
Yes, because the idea of duress. If someone makes you do a thing, that person's guilty.
You don't have to be there and actually stab or shoot.
If you tell somebody to do something and they do what you told them to do, that makes you just as guilty, in my opinion.
Okay, fair enough. Question number 2, would you accept a plea of insanity if Manson's lawyer presented it?
Only under the condition that it still meant he was being locked up. Because I will say the man was insane.
Yeah, absolutely.
When you listen to his rantings and ravings and stuff, he was crazy.
Yeah. Okay. And lastly, what are your personal thoughts on the final decades with Manson? Do you think, and you've kind of already answered this, but do you think he was insane or equally maybe just craved attention?
I think he craved attention. I think that's part of the music thing and him wanting to get into Hollywood the way he did. I don't know. I think he walked the line. I think maybe Manson occupied a place between completely sane and completely insane.
Well, to your point, one of his sayings was, I'm not a good man, or I'm not a good person, I'm not a bad person.
Or that deal, when you look at me, you see yourself.
Yeah.
I think he occupied sort of a weird in-between state. I think by our standards, the man was crazy.
Yes.
But I do think that there was something in Manson that it separated him from your average run-of-the-mill nut jobs,
Yeah.
I think there was something else there. I don't know. I mean, the guy was definitely different.
Different's a good word for it.
Now that, now that I've done the research for this episode, I thought I understand Charles Manson going up to this. Oh, he's just a cult leader guy. But I think there was more to him than that. And not that I, by him,
you're not ready to sign up.
By no means I'm taking, I'm not signing up to be a member of the family.
Okay.
But I do think that I think there was something about him that was different.
Okay.
I saw somewhere that there's this theory that he might have been a victim of like CIA manipulation and stuff.
Oh, wow.
So
that's a totally different rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Well, for me, accept that Manson was guilty.
Manson.
Do I accept that Manson was guilty? Absolutely, yes. We totally agree on that. A plea of insanity. I like the way you worded yours, because I'm thinking if a plea of insanity meant he was going to get off. So I was going to say no. However, follow up, but we all know he was insane.
Yeah.
And finally, his final decades, I think due to that rough upbringing, 15-year-old mom obviously not wanting him, never really getting to know his biological father, his mom remarrying multiple times, being moved all over. He learned a great deal of many bad things.
Yeah.
Which equated to survival. I mean, he robbed grocery stores for food. He was trying to find places to live in the woods, under the bridges. I think equally insane, but was craving that attention possibly, and I'm no, psychiatrist or anything, but most likely that he didn't get from his mother, really craving that attention.
Well, when you listen to, Bo Burnham, when there's a bit he does about comedians craving attention. I mean, maybe that's what it was. Maybe for every nutso that goes off the rails and commits a bunch of atrocities, maybe if they'd have just figured out how to tell a joke, or they had developed their acting skills, or had learned how to sing, maybe if the Beach Boys guy, Wilson there, maybe if he'd saw something in Manson and helped him with a music career, you never would have had this.
Did you listen to any of his songs?
No, I didn't.
They were traditional for the era. They weren't horrible.
Yeah.
There were some of them that was like, okay, I could kind of get into this. The Beach Boys actually did record one of his songs.
They changed the name.
They changed the name, didn't give him any credit, but allegedly those words was, for the most part, his words.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't think he totally bombed the music career. And I think obviously he was rubbing shoulders with the right people, but for whatever reason, he just got missed on that. So yeah, maybe that would have done it. He would have become a front man, a successful musical band, and he may not have went down this other path.
Now,
I don't know.
That's not to say also that I think all, celebrities are crazy and, if they didn't become famous, they'd go off and kill people.
Yeah.
But, again, there was something in him that wanted that attention. And even the murders, they were done to get a reaction.
Yeah.
In his words. We didn't get enough reaction last night, so we're going to do it again.
And he was the prophet that predicted all of this was going to happen. So in essential, he's getting that attention. Speaking
of the weird prophet thing, I saw one that at one point in time, there was an equivalency drawn between Charles Manson and the phrase Charles is man's son.
Oh.
As sort of a, son of man kind of thing. So,
well, that was my questions.
My question's a little more open-ended, but just, I think we've touched on it a little bit, but just doing the research and learning what you learned doing this episode. What's your thought on Manson in general? Like, did your opinions change? Did you walk away with some different insight that you didn't have when you started?
Absolutely. I came into it thinking that he was just some crazy psychopath nut job murderer. And diving into it, I am very probable too much with the sympathy card. sympathetic to his upbringing. Just like what we were talking. I mean, had his life went different ways, what would have happened? Would he still became that? Possibly. Would it have totally changed it? Possibly. Charles Manson was like an onion. There are so many layers there. I do think there was a huge portion of it of what he did, I think, was to crave attention. I think to try to find his spot, to make his spot. And as we were talking about, he's recruiting these young people. He knows about that. He knows what they were going through at that age. He probably came up much worse than many of them. Those type of people are easily manipulated. And you're a good storyteller or whatever. You just bring them in, give them a home, make them feel like they belong. You are a god to them. You become a father figure. You become a mother figure. You become the family figure. You become whatever you want to call it.
He gave them a place to belong.
Yes. Yeah. They belong to something. They meant something. I can't say I was oblivious to that, because that's the essence of any cult is, the belonging, the respect, they'll never turn against family kind of thing. But I guess I just didn't realize the depth of this story.
And I'm kind of like you. I thought I understood the Charles Manson story better than I did when I started reading about it. And I, like I said, I mean, I kind of was sympathetic. I know someone who kind of struggles with the stress of the everyday grind and going to work and dealing with that stuff. I mean, that whole quote, and that's why I picked it.
Yeah.
About like, why would I want to go work for the man? Like, I don't, I mean, at that age, 30 something years old, and him talking about like, why would I want to go work? I got a motorcycle, a sleeping bag, and a dozen women.
Well,
like, yeah.
And it's been said before, but I mean, when we all pass away and they go to visit us at the cemetery, hopefully we can afford a stone. I don't think you're ever going to find a stone that says, I wish I would have spent more time at work.
Yeah.
Or, hey, this guy made $100,000 or this guy made $300,000 a year. Who cares?
Well, and another thing, and I think, I can't remember where I first heard this. I almost want to say it was like Game of Thrones. But we all continue to exist until someone says our name for the last time.
Yeah.
People will talk about Charles Manson a lot longer, I imagine, than they'll talk about me.
Yeah. Yeah.
There'll still be people talking about Charles Manson 100 years from now.
Yeah, he wanted to be remembered, and he'll be remembered. He
achieved his goal.
I mean, books, movies, I mean, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
Well, we hope that you've enjoyed tonight's episode. If you did, give us a like and a share, and don't forget to subscribe. You can find Nightmares on the Lost Highway on Facebook, on YouTube, Spotify, and a dozen or more other platforms. We would appreciate your support, and just doing those few little small things, those likes, those subscriptions, those shares, they really help us out a lot. Until next time, I'm Eric Tudor.
And I'm Bill Weirs.
And together we bring you Nightmares on the Lost Highway. Thanks for listening.
Hey, real quick, call to action. I think Eric would agree. We'd like to grow this. Nightmares on the Lost Highway.
Absolutely.
If you could, if you're listening on Apple, if you would go and give us a review and rate us. If you have some feedback, that's fine too. Whatever platform you're listening, follow us, rate us, give us some reviews. That helps get some recognition and gets our name out there.
We do have a Facebook page, Nightmares on the Lost Highway. You can easily find us if you want to communicate with us, if you want to share some possibilities for future podcasts with us. Reach out. We want to talk with you guys.
I want to take a time to thank the people that helped bring this all together. Alex Tudor, you can almost call him our producer at this point. Sarah Tudor, who also helps with some of the technical stuff. I want to take a moment to extend thanks to Eric for letting us use his space to record in, kind of our makeshift studio.
I, in turn, would like to thank Bill for, one, putting up with me and using this camaraderie to do something we both very much love and enjoy doing, and thank Bill's family for allowing him to spend all the time to work and clean up our recordings and present them in what you hear in the final terms, the final edition, if you will.
And I'd like to thank all of you for continuing to listen. I know we've got some loyal followers out there. We do this as a labor of love, but we're happy that there are people that enjoy it hopefully as much as we do.
Thank you very much.